Hi there. Today I want to talk to you about lenses and looking after them. It's something that comes up quite a lot in my workshop, so I thought I'd just share my thoughts with you now. Let's get this lens out. So one of the first things that often comes up is about lens filters and using lens filters on the end of your lens. It's quite common advice you see around is that people save up and spend their money on the best lens they can afford, and the obvious advice is to protect that investment by putting something like a UV filter on the end of the lens to protect that lens from finger marks, scratches and smears, anything like that. And I kind of get that. I do get the logic behind that. You don't want any damage to happen to something that you've invested a lot of money in. But for me it's the complete opposite kind of thinking. You've spent so much money, you've invested so much money, sometimes these lenses cost more than the camera itself, and you've done that so you can get the best quality image you can from it. And then to do that, and then to put this much cheaper bit of glass on the end of your lens and compromise the quality of the final picture just seems a little bit counterproductive to me. Now I understand if you live in a house where there's lots of kids running around, or maybe you share your lenses with other people, I can really understand why you'd want to take that extra bit of precaution in those kind of circumstances. But if you're out and about in an environment that really matters to you and you really care about, and you want to get the best quality picture you can of it, I really would encourage you to take the filter off and photograph it with the equipment that you've invested in, with nothing compromising that. So that's my thoughts on lens filters and using them in that kind of way. The other thing I want to talk about is lens hoods. So it's quite a common question about whether you use lens hoods or not, and the answer is yes, always. It's interesting that I've never bought a lens without a lens hood, yet I see a lot of people walking around with cameras and lenses without using their lens hoods, and this is why. So the first thing, it's a bit of a byproduct, it's not the primary function of a lens hood, but the first thing you'll notice is now this lens hood is on, let's take the lens cap off, it's actually quite hard to get finger marks and scratch the end of that lens because it's so well protected with the lens hood. We could photograph kids, 2-3-year-olds, and they'd have to get very lucky or try very hard to actually get their fingers on the end of this lens here. Equally, we could be walking around the countryside, around bracken and bushes or trees or whatever, and it's still very much protected from those things as well. It's not going to get scratched from walking around there. But the main purpose of a lens hood is actually to protect it from the light. So even today inside this space here, you can see there's lots of light bouncing around, and if we were outside there'd be lots of light bouncing around off windows, glass buildings, cars, things like that. And with all that light bouncing around, it can cause what we call lens flare. Now we're all used to lens flare, we see it quite a lot in landscapes and in adverts, you know, where the light's coming from directly behind into the camera and creating these pretty orbs that float around the picture. But more subtle lens flare can be a lot more damaging to photos, especially when it doesn't look deliberate as well. But when light comes at a tight angle and hits the glass, that flare, what that causes is a softening of the image and the focus. Sometimes in more extreme cases it can look a bit hazy too. But so when that happens, you might not even notice it on the back of the camera straight away. You might not see it until you look at the computer, and you might assume that maybe the autofocus didn't work properly then, or maybe it was a bit of camera shake. But what it is a bit of lens flare that's happening, and that's why the lens hood is so essential for environments like that. It's particularly useful in night photography as well, where you've got lots of light coming from unpredictable places like cars, trucks, buses, things like that, and not to mention all the street lights that are scattered around. So protecting that lens from unwanted lens flare that can cause havoc with your image is a really important thing, and it's why the lens hood is so useful tool when you're out taking photographs. So hopefully that makes sense too. So on to looking after the lens. So the first thing I do is get the blower brush. Now you could use, some people use canned air to do it, compressed air, but I find this just as effective. It's a lot more environmentally friendly and doesn't sit well with me paying for a can full of air, so that's why I use this. And what we're doing here is just blowing away any bit of dirt, sand, I don't know, maybe biscuit crumbs if you've been having a coffee and a biscuit over your camera bag. And what we do, get rid of that just so there's nothing like that that's going to scratch the lens when we run the lens cloth over it. So now that I've blown away any kind of damaging crumbs, particles of sand or whatever, now I can just run the lens cloth off and make sure all the dust is clear off it. Now if there was some more stubborn grease marks or a finger mark or something like that, I can use this, which is a lens pen, and it's like a pen shape. It's got a bit of material on the end, and I can just rub that over the end of the lens. Now it's always good to look at the end of the lens at different angles, because you don't always, if you're looking straight at it, you might not always see the marks. So look at it at different angles, and then you just rub the mark just gently with your lens pen until they disappear. Now the other thing to remember to do is your lens cap. Just clean your lens cap as well. I'm notorious for carrying, lens caps, there you go, in my pocket, picking up all sorts of dust and stuff. So you don't want to clean that lens and then suddenly put a dusty lens cap on the end of that. So clean that as well before you put that on. Check the bottom, especially if you're changing lenses quite frequently. It's always good to just check the elements at the bottom as well, check they're clean. And that's fine. Bridge cameras as well is exactly the same process, you know. They're not as well protected because they haven't got any lens hoods on them, on these ones anyway. And I find there's lots of little grooves and indents that dust and dirt can get in as well. So it's always good to get into those and put some air in there to get them out if they're in there. Exactly the same again, look at it at different angles to see if there's any marks. Quite easy to get marks on these actually, so it's always good to check these out. And exactly the same thing with the lens pen if there were any marks on there. So that's how I look after my lenses. I'll do that kind of before a shoot every time, even the night before, the morning before, depending on what time the shoot is. But that's how regularly I'll check and clean the lenses, because your lens is your primary tool to get the image, and that's what's going to be impacting on the quality really. I always take the lens pen and the lens cloth with me in the camera bag, just in case you might be out and it starts to rain and you get a bit of droplets on the water. If you're photographing a stream, sometimes you get a bit of surface spray come up and land on the lens, and once you get a drop of water on the lens, you have to get it off. It stays there as a droplet, and you don't want to be using the sleeve of a coat or a jumper to do that. So always make sure you've got these with you. Other than that, I think I've covered everything. So hopefully you found that useful. If there's something I haven't covered or you're unsure about, please enter in the comments below and I'll try and answer them for you. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and I'll see you again next time.